Alright guys, so welcome back to a brand new video. So now that we've actually came this far and integrated a database into our application, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into authentication because I feel like authentication is a very important topic. And I'm going to show you guys how we can implement authentication in NestJS. So there's documentation on this in the NestJS docs if you want to reference this, okay? But essentially what we're going to do in this video is we're going to go ahead and set up local authentication. And it's going to be very simple. We're going to be using Passport as well as Passport local. So we're not going to be using Auth 2. That's what they mean when they say local authentication, is when you actually have your own username and password for your application. So essentially this is going to be a pretty straightforward guide that I'm going to show you guys. The idea behind authentication is you want to be able to protect your application, and you only want to grant access to those who you know are actually using the application. So for example, you don't want certain people to use your application unless they are logged in. And in order for them to use the application, they must be authenticated. So what you do is you set up some kind of system where the user can provide their credentials, so their username or their email, along with their password or some kind of token. And then you can validate that in the backend. So the backend is going to take care of searching if the user exists in the database, and they're going to check to see if the user exists. Then they'll validate the passwords. And typically when it comes to password validation, it's going to take the raw password the user provided. It's going to hash that password using some kind of password encryption or password encryptor. So usually bcrypt is very common, and or I should say hasher instead of, I should say encoder, not encrypt, password encoder. And it's going to compare the hash of that password with the hash that is saved in the database. And if those hashes are the same, it's going to return true. It's going to say that the user is authenticated. However, if those hashes are not the same, then it's going to return false, and it's going to say that the user is not authenticated. I guess that's just the general idea when it comes to authentication. And don't worry, I'm going to teach you guys everything you need to know on how to set this up. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead into our application. And let me just exit the NestJS app for just a quick moment. And what we'll do is we will install a couple of dependencies. So first, we'll install NestJS Passport. So that's at NestJS/Passport. And that is just the Passport wrapper that NestJS created. We'll install Passport, which is just the actual Passport package. And then we'll also install our strategy. So we're going to use Passport local for this. Okay. Now, if you're using something like Discord authentication or Facebook Auth 2, you would install that strategy instead of Passport local. So let's install these packages. And like I said, you need to make sure you have a database or at least some kind of in-memory store for your users. Okay, but since we already have a database set up, this will just align perfectly. Okay, so let's go ahead and install one more thing, and we're going to install the types for Passport local. So we'll just annotate it with -d, so it saves as a dev dependency. Okay, and now that we're done, we can just start up our server again. Okay. So now that we have done the installation of our packages, what's next? So what's next is we need to actually set up an authentication module, or at least that's what I will recommend you guys do. Ideally, you want to separate your business logic away from authentication. I wouldn't really consider authentication part of like the business logic, because really it's separate. It's really its separate functionality. So it's really good to separate your authentication module away from customers and users. So what I'll do is I'll exit the application again, and then what I'll do is I'll just do nestg for generate, and we'll generate a module, and I'll call this auth, short for authentication. Okay, and we are going to actually set up a controller and a service for this. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll set up a controller first. So let's do nestg controller, and this controller is going to go inside the auth module. So we'll do auth/controllers, And I think this should be fine. I think. Yeah, I should call it auth controller. There we go. So we'll create a folder called auth. Okay, and then we'll create a service. Okay, and we'll put that into the auth folder inside services. Okay, there we go. So we have our controller and we have our service. Okay, so now that we have that, what we need to do is we need to create endpoints where the user can actually hit, so that way they can actually log in. Because really, when it comes to local authentication, since we're doing our own like local authentication, they're going to have to make a post request to our own controller. So what is next is we need to create our strategy. So I'll go ahead and just create a folder, and I'll call this utils, and I'll create a strategy file. So I'll call this local strategy.ts. So what we'll do is we'll just go ahead and create a class called local strategy. You can call it whatever you want. And what we want to do is we want to extend the passport strategy. So what we'll do is we'll extend this passport strategy, and this is going to take in the strategy, which is just going to be imported from passport, or it should be imported from passport local actually. Okay. So let me just do that real quick. Cool. All right. So we're basically going to extend passport strategy, and we're going to call this function, and it's going to go ahead and take in this strategy. Okay. Now what we do next is we need to set up the constructor. And for the constructor, this is where we're going to need to actually inject the service where we actually find the user. Okay, so essentially the idea behind this authentication scheme is what we need to do is we need to validate the user. If you actually look at the documentation, and really we're just following this documentation, what they do is they call a method called validate user, and this method comes from the auth service. And you can see what they're doing inside the auth service is they're actually finding the user, and they're comparing the user, and they're comparing the passwords. Or I'm sorry, they're not comparing the user. They are searching if the user exists, and if the user does exist, they're going to compare the passwords. And if all that is true, then it's going to return the actual user. And that's what the auth service validate user method takes care of. Okay, so we're going to need to set up the auth service. Now what I'm going to do is I'll go inside the providers, and I'll go ahead and set up the token. So provide auth service. So this is the same that we've done in our previous videos. Okay. So we're basically, instead of so this allows us to actually use the token to inject the auth service for us. And the reason why you'd want to do this is because this actually allows you to type annotate your services with interfaces, whereas if you just actually were to inject it without using the token, then you would be limited to programming to the implementation rather than interface. That's something that we'll talk about in a future episode. Okay, but for now, just follow along with this. It's the same thing that we did with our other services. Right over here. Okay, so we'll go inside. Let's see, inside auth controller. Sorry, we'll go inside local strategy, and we also let's see. We also need to we also need to annotate this as injectable. Okay, all right. So now we're gonna go ahead and do inject auth service, auth underscore service, private read only, auth service. So right over here, this auth service type annotation, that's what I was basically saying earlier. If you have an interface, you can type annotate auth service as with an interface instead of the actual class itself. And that basically gives you the flexibility when you use the token to inject the repository or to inject the service itself. Okay, so there's a method called validate. So async validate. And this validate method I'm not sure why it doesn't show up in IntelliSense. It should really show up. But this validate method is basically which is basically going to be called. Okay. So we're going to need the username and the password. And inside here is where we're going to actually call the auth services method. And like I said, we're really just following the documentation. So we're going to call the validate user method. So for auth service, what I'll do is I'll create a method and I'll call the method validate user. And this method is going to take in the username as well as the password. Okay. And inside auth service, we're actually going to need to inject the user service. So, and it's actually good that we've actually implemented the user service. We're going to inject the user service and we're going to implement a method called find user. And then we're going to search the database for the user. And we're going to compare the passwords. Okay, so let's kind of take this one step at a time because I know it's a lot of things that's just going on. And I want to make sure that you guys understand everything that's happening. So let's just take it one step at a time. So right now we have created the validate user method. Inside the passport strategy, inside the validate method, we're going to call this the auth service, the validate user, and we're going to pass in the username and the password. Okay. Now, once we do that, it's going to go ahead and call this method. And inside this method is where we're going to need to interact with the user service to get the actual user itself. So the next thing that we're going to have to do is inject the user service. So what we're going to do is we're going to need to, we need to provide the user service inside the auth module.ts file. Let me just open up my terminal. Okay, so let's go and do that. So provide user service and then user service, just like that. Now, when I save, you're going to see that's going to give me an error. And it's going to tell us that so it's similar to what we saw in one of our previous videos where our user service actually has a dependency of its own. It has the user repository. Okay. And because it's using that repository, we need to import type ORM. So we're going to have to do that inside auth module as well. So type ORM module for feature, and we needed to pass in that user entity. So this error should go away. Perfect. Now I should be able to inject that user service into the auth service.ts file. Just like that. Okay. And I should be able to just call whatever methods I need from the user service. So we're going to need to go inside our user service and we're going to need to create a method called find user. And we don't have that already. We only have get user by username, and get user by ID. And those are, don't worry about those methods. Those are interacting with the actual array. We're actually interacting with the database now. So what we'll do is we will simply return, well, this find user method is going to take in, let's see, we're going to find the user based off of their username. You can do username, you can do email, you can do ID, but when you're logging in, you want to make sure that you are you're specifying the username or whatever they're using to log in. So if they're using their username, then you want to search by username. If you're using their email, then you want to search by email. So we'll go ahead and search by username. And I'll actually call this find user by username. Okay. So what we'll do is we will just return this .user repository .find one, and we'll find by username. And there's a chance that this could return undefined. Okay, so or null. I forgot which one it is. I think it's null. I'm not sure. Anyways, so let's go ahead and do const. Let's call this user DB, which indicates that the user is we're searching from the database, and we're going to call user service or this.userService.find user by username, pass in that username. And we're going to have to add the async keyword in front of validate user in order to use the await keyword, because find user by username is going to return a promise and we want to await that. Okay. User DB could be null. So what we'll do is we'll check to see if user DB is found. I'll just console log user DB. So we're not going to jump too far ahead real quick. I'm just going to show you guys how everything is going to work. We're not going to do anything else. Okay. So right now we have our validate user method and we already have our find user by username method. If you look at the documentation, it's very similar. And inside the user service, it takes in the find one. The find one method takes in the username, and you can see that it'll return that user over here. Okay. Now, if the user is found, and if the user was found, it'll return that user. Well, it'll return that user if the passwords are the same, and if the user was not found, it'll return null. Now, we've done everything so far. Before we continue with the actual stuff, let me actually show you guys how we can actually, invoke this passport. Let me show you how we can actually invoke this strategy. So it's actually fairly simple. So all we need to do is first we need to go ahead and import the passport module. Now what's next is we need to actually configure our auth module. Because right now we've only written the code, we've only written the logic, we haven't wired up the logic with passport, so that way you can actually invoke our passport strategy. So to do that, all we need to do is go inside the auth module, and we just need to import the passport module, just like that. And we need to also, inside the providers, we need to go ahead and provide the local strategy right over here. So I have my local strategy imported from utils, okay? And then that passport module is the module that comes from the NestJS passport package. Okay? So now that we've set that up, we need to also use something called a guard, okay? And it's pretty self-explanatory, but essentially what guards are responsible for is it takes care of guarding your routes. So you can protect a certain endpoint based off the user's roles or if they're logged in or not. Okay, so if the user is logged in, but they don't have a specific role, then they cannot use or they cannot access the endpoint. If the user is logged in, or if the user is not logged in, and they will just give them an unauthenticated error or something like that. Okay, so essentially what we need to do is we need to invoke our guard for the user to log in. Now, in order for us to invoke it, first, like I said, make sure you import the strategy as well as the passport module. Just double check we don't have any errors. Good. The next thing that we need to do is inside our controller, so inside auth controller, what I'll do is I'll create a post request route. So post. So we'll call this login, and I'm not going to specify any DTO for now. Okay. So over here, we're going to go ahead and use the use guards decorator, and that comes from NestJS common. And we're going to go ahead and get the auth guard, and the auth guard comes from the NestJS passport package. Okay. And now with the auth guard, we're going to specify the type of guard. So we're just going to put local. So that's just going to be the local guard. And now let's see. Let's go ahead and try to log in. So it should be /API/auth/login. Now it's saying 401 unauthorized. Now let's double check what shows up in the logs. So you can see that right over here. Let's see, where is this being logged from? Let me just double check. So that should be logged from, I think, the auth service. Okay, great. So we know that passport is definitely being, or at least our strategy is definitely being invoked. In order for this validate user to actually be called, it must have went through the local strategy over here. So let's actually add some logs real quick. Let's go ahead and do inside local strategy validate. And let's go ahead and log the username. And let's log the password. Okay. Let me actually add one more log inside validate user. Okay. So if I send the post request again, you'll see that it says inside strategy.validate, and you can see that the username is Anson. Yep. And then the password is whatever we just entered in. So that's this, and then we're inside the valid user. Perfect. Okay, now obviously we haven't finished implementing our logic yet, so we need to actually do that. So going back to the auth service, so if the user is found, what we need to do is we need to compare the password. Okay, so similar to what the documentation had, they checked to see if user was found, and then they checked if user db.password is equal to password. Now, in the next video, I'll actually show you guys how we can actually hash the password. So don't worry, this is not actually something that you should do in an actual real application. Okay. And if this is true, we'll just say user validation success. And if this is false, you'll just return null. And I'll just, yeah, this should be fine. We'll return user validation failed. Okay, and then this will go back to the strategy. From auth service, it'll go back to the local strategy. And right over here, we're going to need to do something with the user. So we'll go ahead and just await this call. So right over here inside the strategy, we can actually do a couple things. One, we can just say if there is no user, then we can just throw a new unauthorized exception, and that should be more than enough. You don't want to really tell like the user if they if like the user was not found. Just tell them that it's unauthorized, so that way the user won't know if the user is actually taken or not. Okay, you don't want to really give that much details to the user usually. So throwing an unauthorized exception is good enough. So if that user is not found in a database, or even if they are found but the password is null, then that'll also work as well. Because remember, validate user will return null if the user is not found or if the passwords do not match. Okay, so if there's no user, throw that exception. Otherwise, we will return the user. And now watch this. So if I click on send, okay, so yeah, you can see now that we have completed the logic. You can see that everything works fine. It gives us a 201 created, which means that we're logged in. If I go ahead and put in the wrong password, it's going to give us a 401 unauthorized error. Okay, so you can see that right over here. If I were to do that, if I put in the wrong username, it would do the same thing. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So one more thing that I want to show you guys before I end the video is right now we have username and password, but oftentimes in many applications there's really no username. It's usually just an email address and the password. So what you can do is you can actually change the options inside Super. And if you want to learn more about the parameters, you can actually just right-click strategy over here. And this strategy over here should give you this strategy options with request interface. And you can go ahead and you can label what the username field is, because sometimes it's not necessarily a username. It can just be, it can be like an email address that serves as the username. So if you want, you can go ahead and label this username field as email. And what will happen is it'll look for the email inside the request body. Okay, so watch this. So if we go back into our application, you'll see that it's now going to search for Anson@gmail.com. You can see right over here that it says Anson@gmail.com. That is being logged as the username instead of the actual username itself. So if you want to, you can rename username. Okay, and obviously right now it's saying validation failed, and the reason why is because we are using a method to search by username instead of email. But I just wanted to mention this just in case you guys might want to change up a couple of things to fit your application's needs. So that's going to be pretty much it for this video. In the next video, we'll set up bcrypt, and I'll show you guys how we can encrypt and not encrypt, hash and hash passwords, as well as compare hash passwords. So that's going to be pretty much it. I'll see you guys in my next video. Peace out.